Ukraine says it can't wait for the war to stop to start rebuilding its country, and it's not waiting. But funds are drying up. That's why it's trying to drum up support, not only for weapons deliveries here at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, but also reconstruction aid. The American-born British financier and political activist Bill Browder was once behind the largest foreign investment portfolio in Russia. I asked him to what extent frozen Russian central bank assets could be used to rebuild Ukraine.
We're in kind of a crucial moment right now where Ukraine is running out of ammunition, Ukraine is running out of resources. The West, who had promised to stay as long as it took, are now hesitating. We've seen Hungarians block EU funds, $50 billion of EU funds. We've seen some small group of far-right Republicans block U.S. funds. And so this is really more a question of how does Ukraine win the war and what funds do they need to win the war? And so I would say that the frozen Russian assets should be used for defense first. And once the war is over, then we can talk about reconstruction.
What sort of sums are we talking about here, first of all? Hundreds of billions?
Well, nobody knows for sure. There's a lack of transparency. Many countries aren't fully disclosing. But we're looking at somewhere between $300 and $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves in the West, in the United States, in the UK, and the EU, and various other places. And it raises a lot of questions, first of all, because each country has their own decisions to make about confiscating this money. But it's clear from both a financial and moral standpoint that Russia should pay for the damage they've done.
How can it be confiscated then?
Well, the money has been frozen, which is the first thing. And if you had asked me, let's say, 3 years ago, before all this happened, would the EU freeze Russian central bank reserves? I would have told you there's no way that there's no way that there's the political will to do that. And they froze that money. Now the money needs to be confiscated. There are many people saying, well, what is that going to do? It creates uncertainty. What about sovereign immunity of Russian money, et cetera? And my argument is that Russia has so broken the international rulebook by invading Ukraine that one can make a clear legal argument to confiscate this money. And most importantly, the money, it's either going to come out of our pocket or it's going to come out of the Russians' pocket, and Putin should pay before we pay for his war.
What could happen, worst case scenario, when it comes to financial stability and siphoning off so much money all at once?
Well, the fearmongers say that if this happens, if this money is confiscated, then everyone will abandon the euro and the dollar and the sterling and the Swiss franc.
Why?
Because they'll think that these are not safe currencies. But then where are they going to put their money? Are they going to put their money in China or in Saudi Arabia? I mean, it's kind of an absurd argument and a very sort of narrow-minded argument to say that people aren't going to own the U.S. dollar or the euro because of this. Sure, if you're about to invade a neighbor and cause hundreds of billions of dollars of damage, you might not be keeping your money in euros and dollars. But I think that for the most part, it doesn't have any effect on financial stability. And what's interesting is that the people who are saying this are politicians, not financiers. I've been in the financial markets for my whole life. And I can tell you that the dollar and the euro will continue to be reserve currencies after this is done.
Some people are saying this would set a dangerous precedent. It is uncharted territory, but wouldn't it be sending a very strong signal to Russia, to others, about starting wars?
Indeed, this was the main unexpected consequence of doing this is that it will act as a massive deterrent on China going into Taiwan. If you have a country with a lot of foreign exchange reserves and a mission to do something terrible, they may say, well, these foreign exchange reserves that we have are probably more valuable to us than whatever that aggressive plan we have to invade a foreign country. And so I would say that yes, it sets a precedent, which is that if you invade your neighbors, you're not going to get to keep your money.
In the meantime, the debate is hot between various countries in the European Union, Germany, Italy, Belgium, France, worried about just channeling the profits made from these frozen assets that they're holding at the moment, which in some cases amount to some 3 billion euros, I believe.
Well, so this is the really interesting thing. So the European Union has gotten their head around the idea of taking some of Russia's money, confiscating some of these reserves. And so the moment you confiscate 1% or 3% or whatever percent it is that you want to confiscate, you've already crossed the Rubicon. Why confiscate 2% when you can confiscate 100%? Ukraine needs the money. Russia has done the damage. You've already crossed the line. It just seems like kind of a baby step that's unnecessary when it's clear to me that in some period of time, the political will be there to confiscate all the money.
What about the legalities of all of this? Can you bring us up to speed on what's right, what's wrong here?
Well, so the Russian government will be screaming bloody murder, and they're saying this is a violation of law. This is money that belongs to the sovereign state of Russia. This money is protected by sovereign immunity, which is like your embassy can't be touched. The Western lawyers are going to make the argument that there's something called the law and countermeasures. If you invade a foreign country and you create $300 billion, $400 billion, $1 trillion worth of damages, that you owe those damages to the country you've invaded. And there's many situations in the world where there are conflicts of laws. This is one where it's pretty clear that the conflict of law, the sovereign immunity, is trumped by the law and countermeasures, and that's the argument that the lawyers will make.
What about the threats coming from Russia then? Threats of tit-for-tat reprisals when it comes to seizing of assets. Is Russia in a position to seize assets of any types?
Well, it's not as if the U.S. Federal Reserve is keeping their rubles in the Russian central banks. I don't think that that's going to happen. But we're here in Davos, and I was just having a dinner on Monday night, and one of the attendees was a senior executive from the Hyundai company in Korea. They had a $3 billion investment in car manufacturing in St. Petersburg, and they were forced to sell it for $114 back to the Russian, to some Russian. And so the expropriation on the private sector side has already happened. It's not like Western corporate assets are now at risk. They've either been liquidated voluntarily by these Western companies, or they're being expropriated by the Russian government now, even before this happens. And so I would say that that's a sort of red herring, that shouldn't be standing out there.
What else could Russia do?
They can huff and they can puff and they can scream bloody murder as they will, and that will be that. And for what it's worth, this is also not just to help Ukraine, but this is a way of punishing Putin. We need to punish him for what he's done. He needs to pay a dear price. His people need to see that this is what happens when you do something so foolhardy as invade and murder your neighboring country.
You're a Kremlin critic, but you're also, or were, a huge investor in Russia. How would you feel seeing all of those assets, all that money suddenly being shifted out of Russia to Ukraine?
I think I would breathe a huge sigh of relief. I think it would be the morally right thing to do. Ukraine is desperate to stand up on their own 2 feet. And before we start sending our money from the West, Putin should pay for the war he caused. And the Ukrainians should get Putin's money to fight back. And that seems like the only good, honest thing to do. And it's interesting, when I talk about this publicly, when I talk about it on Twitter, the response is unanimous that this is the right thing to do. And people in the West can't understand why it hasn't been done yet.
How much money does Ukraine need when it comes to reconstruction? I've been reading around 400 billion euros and upwards.
The numbers I've read are well north of 400 billion. I've seen numbers as high as $1 trillion. And it all depends on how you measure the damage and what kind of reconstruction needs to be done. But
we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about electricity grids, housing, hospitals, etc.
I mean, you can look at the pictures of Mariupol and Bucha, and they've been leveled to the ground. And by the way, this doesn't even take into account the loss of life, the complete destruction of humanity that's happened there. There's just untold damage that needs to be compensated, and the dam that was blown up by the Russians. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and it's almost unimaginable what the Russians have done in Ukraine, because that's what they do. They do a scorched earth total destruction strategy. And it's not just in Ukraine. They did that in Chechnya. They did that in various places in Georgia. In Syria, this is what the Russians do. They don't really know how to build. They know how to destroy.
And in this case, not just a dam, also a nuclear power plant.
And on and on and on. And it's, and we're not anywhere near done with this war. Putin has made it clear he's carrying on. And so whatever the measurement of damages is, that's just an interim measure, and the damages are going to get worse. Every day there's missile attacks from Russia into Ukraine.
So do you see problems in investing in reconstruction at the same time as a war continues?
It seems to me that this war needs to be won. Ukraine needs the money to win the war, and that's got to be the first and only priority, and then we talk about reconstruction.
Would you put your money in Ukraine right now?
I'd wait until the war is over.
That's not what Ukraine needs. It says it needs that money now to start rebuilding now. I was just mentioning the electricity grid, the housing problem. I mean, how does life go on close to the front lines of a war?
Well, most importantly, the Ukrainian citizens who are there need heating, they need electricity, they need hot water, they need, to function on a day-to-day basis. But I think it's right now duct tape and, whatever, temporary measures to keep everything going while we try to get this war won. And what they need more than anything is weapons, serious weapons to expel Russia from their territory.
But why your caution or hesitancy? Is it because you'd like to see public funds, not private funds, first of all, put in, or does it require a joint effort?
Well, at this stage of the game, private investors, are looking at risk and looking at return. And how do you measure the risk if a bomb comes in and destroys everything you might have built? And so, at this stage of the game, this is all about, in my mind, about defense.
So the reality is, people here in Davos, private investors here in Davos, are first going to be looking at their return on investment, the risks involved. But is that where states need to step up?
Yeah, when the private sector doesn't work, that's when the public sector needs to step in. And this is a situation where, for the survival of Ukraine, they need public funds. And the West has been, and Europe and the United States and the UK have been providing funds. And they need to continue to provide funds. But it shouldn't just be the taxpayers of our countries that provide those funds.
The argument then, as far as the US goes, the UK is stepping up funding to try to fill that gap. The EU is trying as well. How would you convince American politicians here to continue that support?
Well, I think that most American politicians that I know, and I know a lot of them, are fully on the side of Ukraine. And it's not a I don't think it's a long-term issue right this second. I think that Congress will find a way to provide, U.S. Congress will provide a way to provide that the 63 some odd billion that's been promised this year. The elephant in the room is what happens when there's a new president. In November of this year, there'll be a U.S. presidential election. President Trump, I should say former President Trump, is the front runner right now. He said that he will end the war in one day. What he means by that is he will stop funding Ukraine. And if that happens, then does Europe have the resources to step up? And by the way, it comes back to the frozen Russian reserves. I might even describe them as Donald Trump insurance.
Explain why, how that would work.
Well, basically, if Donald Trump is going to cut off Ukraine from funding, and Ukraine needs the funds, there's one big pile of money right there, which is these Russian central bank reserves of $300+ billion that can be drawn on to fill the gap that Donald Trump will leave.
Bill Browder, pleasure talking to you. Fantastic. Thank you for breaking down the numbers for us on a very complex, complicated issue.
Thank you.